A huge part of a room like this is the media. Now we're going to have a fantastic TV over on that wall, but we wanted to hide the components, so we're making this media cabinet. And we started out just with the same basic steps. We cut some plywood, we dadoed for the shelves, we rebaited the back to accept the 1/4-inch plywood, put some micro pocket holes to attach the face frame, and drilled for shelf pin holes. But there's a few things that are going to be different about this cabinet. Now down here in the bottom we do have holes for an adjustable shelf, but we've also added a pull-out shelf at the bottom. As you can see in the middle section of this cabinet, we've got some extra pieces. I've made an L-shaped piece by pocket screwing together 2 pieces of cherry, and that actually installs behind the face frame. As you can see, I've already got this one over here in place. Now there are some dados in those to allow for our hinges to be able to mount to the face frame. But that piece is really important to me because what it does is block over my hardware so that when we pull out the shelf it misses the door. As you can see down here, the door is in the opening, so if I didn't block this over, then when the shelf pulled out it would hit the door. So you have to think about that and do a little bit of measuring and planning to see just how much you need to block in, and it kind of depends on what hardware that you're using. Now I also added a piece of blocking in the back for this bracket on my hardware to mount to. And again, it kind of depends on what hardware you use, exactly what you have to do. But it's pretty well the same concept. Now, we've also dressed up this cabinet a little bit with some moldings. We started out though by running just the standard baseboard that's going through the rest of the room around the cabinet. This cabinet's all one depth. It's not like that step back cabinet that we've built previously, but we're able to get a little bit of that look by running this nice big molding right around the middle. We also made a detail around the top that's built up from 2 different pieces of molding to really dress up the top. Now there's one other molding trick that we're going to be doing on this cabinet, and it has to do with this plywood end of the cabinet. The first thing that you see when you come down the stairs into this room is this media cabinet, so we really want it to pop and get your attention, kind of be a preview of just how nice the rest of the room is going to be. We're going to add some moldings to the end of this cabinet, so instead of just having a flat plywood panel, you've really got a great looking trim detail. But we're going to take a look at that later. Now let's see just what I need to do to mount these pull-out shelves. I'm starting to put the hardware on for the second pull-out shelf. Now the first one's really easy because everything just rests off the fixed shelf of the cabinet. Now I've found that it's easier to work from the bottom up, and what I've done is cut these blocks for everything to sit on and to support off the one that I installed first. If you look at the back, we've added a cleat for my drawer hardware to rest on. I don't want to mount any of that until I've had a chance to put the shelf in and square it up with the front of the cabinet. Then we'll drive those screws, we'll remove the cleat, and be ready to move on up to the next shelf. Now I always take my measurements from the top down. It's kind of like having a benchmark. If I were to get a little bit off on this shelf and then a little bit more off on the next one, it could be a real mess by the time I get to the top. But if I keep measuring for each one from the top down, I'm going to stay real close to right on. So we're going to go ahead and install the next 2 pull-out shelves, and then we'll be ready to install our doors. All right, that pretty well finishes the doors off. Now we're down to that last detail, which is going to make a ton of difference in the way this cabinet looks, and that's putting molding on the end. We've made some small molding just using a router, and truthfully this can be made almost out of scrap. That's one of the things I love about it. I could take just some small pieces of wood that we might have thrown away otherwise and turn it into something that adds a lot of value, a lot of pop to my cabinet. Now another just quick little trick can be, sometimes you can rip the molding you're going to use for this out of a bigger piece. If you've ever trimmed doors and windows in the house, you know you end up with lots of short pieces of casing trim that aren't quite big enough to make the header on a door, but you kind of hate to throw them away. Well, sometimes you can look at that profile, cut a piece out, and end up with a molding that looks like this. What I like to do is nail these pieces together in a frame and then install the whole frame to the side of the cabinet. To me, it seems easier to do that than to try and put them one piece at a time around the cabinet. So what I want to be doing is putting just a little bit of glue in the joints, and then we'll nail them together with a headless pinner, take the finished piece over and put it on the side of the cabinet. Now, another thing that I've just found, if you let the edge of the wood hang out over the edge of the table you're working on, you can get a lot better angle to put your nails in there. Or in this instance, it's 23 gauge headless pins. Now, I'm being really careful to keep my fingers well back away from where I'm putting these pins in there, because I don't want one to come out in the wrong place and have my finger there. There's a great example of what can happen if you got your finger too close. All right, let's try that from another angle. Sometimes those things just hit. Now what I want to do here, it would be impossible to drive that nail back through, but what I found is if I'll just wiggle it back and forth, it'll break off below the surface, and that's not an issue. If you try and nip it off using a pair of pliers or something, it's always going to still be above the surface. I can run my hand back and forth over that without any problem because I nipped it below the surface. Okay. All right, so here's our first frame. Now we'll work on the taller one. And you know, proportions, it's just somewhat what's pleasing to your eye, but what I generally try and do is come in 2 or 2.5 inches in from the sides and maybe stay away from the baseboard or the other moldings on the side of that cabinet by about 2 inches. That's a proportion that looks pretty good to me, but you know, you can always just look at it and say, hey, that's what looks good to me. All right, that's the short one. Now I'm going to go ahead and make the tall panel. And I'm just putting 2 panels on the side of this cabinet. You could even put, if it's a wider cabinet, you might put 2 narrower panels. That just gets into a lot more work. All right. Now we're ready. Now here's one other thing that you need to remember when you're nailing molding like this on the side of a cabinet. Make sure that your fasteners that you're using are short enough to where you're not shooting nails all the way through the inside of the cabinet. Made that mistake a few times, I'm afraid to say. So I'm going to make sure I've got some shorter fasteners. Then we're going to go over and nail this to the side of the cabinet. Here's where you can really see the contrast between having the panel mold on the end of this cabinet and not. After all the work that we've gone to on this cabinet, I can't imagine skipping this step. Now, all I'm going to do is put a 2-inch spacer here, put my frame up here. Now use a marking or layout tool to space it back. Check it a couple times as I'm going up. I'm just going to check a couple times here to make sure it looks about the same off the wall. I should be able to just nail that off. Now, usually I'll tell people there's always room for more trim. But I can't imagine another thing we do to that cabinet that make it look even better than it does right now.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this material, don't forget to like and subscribe.